The house had been empty for 7 months when I first entered it, and it smelled of empty houses, that particular compound of damp plaster, cold hearths, and the absence of cooking that settles into a building once the people who gave it warmth have gone. I was there not on any errand of my own, but as a favor to a solicitor named Burrell, who had asked me to attend a valuation of the property as a medical witness, since one of the outstanding questions in the estate that owned the house was whether its previous occupant had been of sound mind at the time of his last testamentary decisions. The solicitor was late. This was, I subsequently discovered, characteristic of Burrell in all his professional dealings, but I did not know this yet. I had arrived at the Islington address at the appointed time, found the door unlocked by the estate's managing agent as arranged, and had let myself in to wait. I waited in the front hallway for perhaps 20 minutes. The house was cold and largely stripped of furnishings. The estate was in the process of being wound up, and most of the furniture had been removed to storage or sold. What remained were the bones of the place, the panelling, the mantelpieces, the wallpaper in its various stages of preservation, the bare boards that had been under carpets and were a slightly different color from the boards that had not. I was examining the hallway wallpaper, which showed a repeated pattern of stylized birds that struck me as faintly oppressive in the context of an empty house. When I heard it, it came from below, not from the floor directly under my feet, but from somewhere further back in the building, the rear section, which I later determined sat above the kitchen basement. A sound that was not the settling creak of old timber, not the movement of a pipe contracting in the cold. A sound that was clearly, unmistakably, a human voice, not speaking, not calling out. Something lower than speech and more urgent, a sound pressed through a constraint, as if the person making it was doing so at the limit of what they dared. I stood very still and listened. It came again. I moved toward the back of the hallway, past the stripped staircase, past the door that opened into the empty back parlor, and found the door to the basement stairs. It was latched. I unlatched it and stood at the top of the stairs, listening. A third time, closer now. And this time, this is the thing that stayed with me through everything that followed. The sound resolved itself, for just a moment, into something that was almost a word, a shape of sound that might have been a name, or a plea, or simply the compressed expression of a presence that needed to be acknowledged. I went down the stairs. The basement of the Calloway Street house was divided into 3 sections: a coal cellar at the front, a kitchen that still held its range and larder shelving, and a back room that had been used, by the evidence of the fittings on the walls, as some kind of storage space or workroom. The coal cellar was empty. The kitchen was cold and stripped. The back room had its door closed, and the door had a bolt on the outside, a bolt that was drawn. I stood looking at that bolt for a moment. It had not been drawn by accident. A bolt on the outside of a door is drawn deliberately, by a person standing outside the door. There was no other way to position it. I drew it back and opened the door. The room beyond was approximately 12 feet square. There was a small window, very high up, frosted glass, that admitted a grey and minimal light. There was a cot against one wall, a prison cot, the kind with a thin mattress and a metal frame. There was a bucket, there was a wooden chair, there was a small table, and on the table was a tin cup and a plate that had recently held food. And in the chair, wrapped in a blanket that had been made to do the work of several blankets through sheer determination of use, sat a man. He was perhaps 60, or had the appearance of a man of 60 who might be considerably younger. He was bearded not neatly, but in the way of a man who has had no razor for some months. His hands, when he raised them to shield his eyes from the additional light of the open door, were the hands of someone who had once been used to better conditions and had adapted to these with a thoroughness that spoke of time. He was thin, not the thinness of illness, but the thinness of rationing. He looked at me with eyes that were alert and clear and extremely frightened. "Are you from him?" he said. "I am from no one," I said. "I am a doctor. My name is Watson. I was let into this house by an estate agent, and I heard you from the hallway." "Who are you, and how long have you been here?" The man looked at me for a long moment. Then something in his face changed, not a collapse, but the very particular alteration that happens to a person who has been holding something with great effort for a very long time and is, for the first time, being offered the possibility of setting it down. "My name," he said, "is Reginald Ware, and I have been in this room for approximately 4 months, though I have lost the precise count." He paused. "I was told, when I was put here, that if I made noise or attempted to leave, my daughter would be harmed. I want you to understand that before you ask me why I did not call out sooner." I pulled the wooden chair away from the table and sat down, and I began to ask him questions. He had been a printer, not a compositor or a press operator, but a printer in the fuller sense, a man who had owned and operated a small printing house in Clerkenwell for 23 years, producing commercial work, pamphlets, private publications, and, in the later years of the business, a specialty in high-quality document reproduction for solicitors and legal firms who needed reliable copies of complex instruments. The business had done adequately. Not prosperously, the margins in commercial printing were not wide, but adequately, which meant that by the time he was in his early 50s, Reginald Ware had a business that kept his household comfortable, a daughter of 28 named Iris who helped with the bookkeeping, and a position in the Clerkenwell trade that was respectable without being remarkable. The trouble had begun, as he described it, with a commission. In the spring of 1895, a man had come to the Clerkenwell printing house and requested a specialized piece of work. The man had given his name as Mr. Faulkner. The work was, on its surface, unremarkable, a reproduction of a complex legal document, specifically a codicil to a will, produced to a very high standard of fidelity to the original. The reason given for needing the reproduction was equally unremarkable. The original was being held in disputed estate proceedings, and a faithful copy was needed for reference purposes. Ware had done the work. He was good at it. His reputation in this area was precisely why the commission had come to him, he believed. He had produced a reproduction that was, to any examination below the forensic, indistinguishable from the original. He had been paid well. He had not, at the time, understood the full significance of what he had produced. "The codicil changed the distribution of an estate," he said, to me, in that cold basement room, in a voice that was steady in the manner of a man recounting something he has gone over many times in his own mind and has arrived at a clear account of. "I did not know this when I took the commission. I learned it 8 weeks later, when a solicitor named Pierce came to my printing house and told me that a document I had produced had been used as evidence in probate proceedings and that there was a question about its authenticity. Did you tell Pierce you had made it?" I told him the truth, that I had been commissioned to make a copy for reference purposes and had done so, that I had understood the work to be legitimate, that I had no knowledge of how the copy had been subsequently used. He stopped. Pierce listened to me. He made notes. He left. A pause. 2 weeks later, I was told that I was to be charged with fraud and forgery, that the document I had produced had been presented in the probate proceedings as the original, in place of the actual original, and that this had resulted in the estate being distributed according to terms that benefited one party significantly at the expense of another. "But you didn't know that was how it would be used." I did not, but I had no proof of that. I had no written record of the commission. Mr. Faulkner had paid in cash and had not signed any documentation. This was unusual, I knew, but not unheard of for a client who valued discretion. I had no correspondence, no contract, no evidence of any kind that the work had been commissioned by someone else for a stated purpose. I had the document and my fingerprints on it and my name on the business that produced it, and nothing else. He had, he told me, been visited twice more before his arrest, once by Faulkner himself, who had told him, with the calm of someone who has considered all the outcomes in advance, that there was nothing Ware could say that would help him, since anything he said about Faulkner could not be proven and would simply make him appear to be adding fabrications to the existing evidence. The second visit had been from a man Ware did not recognize, who had told him something about his daughter Iris. What did he tell you about her? That she was being watched. that she was healthy, and that whether she remained healthy depended on how cooperative I was during the proceedings. He looked at me steadily. That is not a precise quotation. He was very careful about precision. He said nothing that could, taken individually, be interpreted as a threat. But the message was entirely clear. Reginald Ware had stood trial for fraud and forgery in July of 1895. His defense had been the truth that the work had been commissioned for a legitimate purpose, and that he had no knowledge of its subsequent use. But without documentation, without a name for the commissioning party, without any corroborating witness, the truth had looked, to the jury, like an unconvincing invention. He had been convicted and sentenced to 3 years. He had served 11 days of that sentence. On the 12th day, he had been released. Not officially, no paperwork, no discharge. He had been removed from the prison in the early hours of the morning by people he did not know and brought, in a cab with the blinds drawn, to the house on Calloway Street. He had been in the basement room for 4 months. I left Reginald Ware in the kitchen while I met Burrell, the solicitor, at the front door. He arrived 40 minutes after the appointed time, entirely without apology, and I told him that I had been taken ill with a sudden indisposition and would need to reschedule. This was the first dishonesty I employed in this case, and I record it only because what came after required a great many more, and the first one matters in the accounting. I gave Ware my coat for the cab ride to Baker Street. He wore it with the expression of a man wearing something impossibly normal in impossibly abnormal circumstances. We sat across from each other in the cab, and he asked me, with the precise, careful diction I was coming to understand, was his habitual mode of speech, whether I believed him. "I believe you," I said. "The conditions in which I found you are not consistent with any voluntary arrangement. A man does not choose to live in a basement room with a bolted door and a cot for 4 months, for reasons that do not involve compulsion. There are people who will say I escaped from prison. There are. And the question of how to address that is one that my associate is considerably better placed to think through than I am. Holmes was in Baker Street. He had been, by the evidence of the tobacco and the untouched breakfast tray, working through a problem of his own for most of the morning. When I knocked and entered, he looked up with the expression that precedes the pleasantry he uses when the state of my coat or boots tells him I have been somewhere unexpected. Then he looked at Reginald Ware, who was standing in the doorway behind me, still wearing my coat, and the pleasantry was set aside. "Sit down," Holmes said, to Ware and to me. "Tell me where you found him and in what condition, before he tells me anything, because I want your medical observations separately from his account." I gave him the condition of the room, the food and water situation, the bolt on the outside of the door, and my assessment of Ware's physical state, which was poor but not dangerously so. A man who had been fed and watered, if not generously, and who had the constitution of someone accustomed to physical work, and who had sustained himself through 4 months by virtue of being, at his core, a person who persisted. Holmes listened without expression. Then he turned to Ware and said, "You were tried in July. Who defended you?" "A barrister named Stroger. He was provided by the court. I could not afford my own counsel by that stage." "And the prosecution's principal witness, the one who testified that the document had been presented as an original rather than a copy, who was that?" "A man named Croft. He claimed to be an associate of the solicitor managing the estate that was the subject of the codicil." Holmes looked at me. Something had happened in his face, that small, controlled shift that I had learned to read as the equivalent, in a man less disciplined than Holmes, of a sharp intake of breath. "Croft," he said. "You know the name," I said. "I know the name in a different context." He turned back to Ware. "Mr. Ware, I am going to ask you a series of questions that will feel, initially, as though they are not related to your situation. I would like you to answer them as precisely as you can." He pressed his fingertips together. "The codicil you reproduced. You said it was a codicil to a will. Did you ever learn the name of the testator, the person whose will it was attached to?" "Hartfield." Edmund Hartfield. I saw the name on the original document I was asked to reproduce. And the estate, do you know what property or funds were at issue? I know only what the court proceedings made public. The estate was substantial land in Surrey and investments. The codicil, as I understood it, altered the distribution to favour one nephew over another. Which nephew benefited from the altered distribution? A man named Walter Crane. He was not present at the trial. He was represented by a solicitor. Holmes nodded, slowly, once. It was the nod of a man confirming a fact that had been in the right place in his mind, waiting for the correct key to unlock it. Walter Crane, he said. And the solicitor representing him was the same man, Croft, who testified against you. Ware looked at Holmes steadily. No, the solicitor was different. But now that you ask, and I have asked myself this many times in 4 months with nothing else to think about, I wonder whether the two men knew each other. They did, Holmes said. Quite well. I can tell you that without having met either of them, because the structure of what you are describing is not new to me. It is a pattern I have encountered in a different form before. You were used, Mr. Ware, not merely as a craftsman, but as what I would call a deniable instrument. A person through whom the fraud could be committed, and upon whom it could be subsequently placed if necessary. The commission of the work, the cash payment, the absence of documentation, these were not careless omissions, they were deliberate constructions. You were being set up from the moment Faulkner walked into your printing house. Ware absorbed this. He showed no surprise, which told me he had arrived at the same conclusion himself during his 4 months of enforced thinking. I know, he said. I have known it for some time. What I do not know is who Faulkner is, and what happened to the original codicil, and where my daughter is, and whether she is safe. Those, Holmes said, are the questions I am now going to work on answering. The first thing I need is to understand why you were taken out of prison and put in a basement rather than left in prison where the sentence kept you quiet. The answer to this question, why Ware had been extracted from prison and hidden rather than left to serve his sentence, took Holmes approximately 18 hours to assemble, during which time Ware was installed in Baker Street under conditions that involved Mrs. Hudson's considerable capacity for practical kindness, and an absolute prohibition on Ware leaving the building or making contact with anyone from his previous life. Holmes was gone for most of those 18 hours. When he returned, he was in the state that followed his most productive working periods, not the manic brightness of a case breaking open, but the focused, deliberate energy of a man who has confirmed a theory and is now managing the implications. 3 reasons, he said, settling into his armchair while Ware and I sat opposite him. The first is the simplest. Someone in the prison, a warder, an administrator, someone with the necessary access, reported that Ware had, within the first week of his sentence, been asking to speak to the governor about new evidence relevant to his case. Whatever he intended to say, and it may have been nothing more significant than a repetition of what he said at trial, it was enough to make someone nervous. A prisoner asking to revisit his case is a loose thread. The easiest way to prevent a loose thread from being pulled is to remove the thread from the room entirely. But removing him from prison is itself a crime, I said. How did they manage it without creating exactly the kind of scrutiny they were trying to avoid? That is the second reason for the basement. The extraction from prison was arranged to look, from the official record, like an administrative transfer. There are people who can make this happen, who have the right connections within the prison service to move a prisoner on paper without the movement attracting examination. Ware was transferred, on the record, to a facility in the north. In practice, he was taken to Calloway Street. Holmes paused. The third reason is the most significant. Someone needed Ware available. Not dead, not in prison under normal conditions, but specifically held somewhere accessible, in conditions that kept him compliant. The threat about his daughter was not incidental. It was the mechanism by which he was managed. And why did they need him available? Ware asked. His voice was controlled, but I heard the effort in it. Because the fraud is not concluded. The codicil that you reproduced has altered the distribution of an estate. Yes, but an estate of that kind land in Surrey, significant investments does not transfer in a single transaction. It transfers over time through a series of legal instruments, each of which needs to be consistent with the last. If any one of those instruments is challenged and the original forgery is examined carefully by someone with the right expertise, the whole structure becomes vulnerable. Holmes looked at Ware directly. "You are the one person who could identify Faulkner. You are the one person who could testify to the commissioning of the forgery with specific knowledge of what was asked and how it was done. While you are in that basement, you are under control. You cannot be compelled to testify. But more importantly, you cannot offer to testify voluntarily. They needed you alive and available because the situation might require you to be used again to confirm, under whatever coercion they thought appropriate, some element of the fraud that required your specialist knowledge." Ware was quiet for a moment. "They were going to use me again." "I believe so. At some point when a specific transaction required it, someone was going to come down those stairs with a piece of paper and tell you to confirm it, or examine it, or produce something similar. And you would comply because of what they had told you about your daughter." "Where is she?" Ware said. "Where is Iris?" Holmes found Iris Ware in 3 days. I want to say this without making it sound simple, because it was not 3 days of work that took Holmes through a search of lodging houses, a conversation with a woman who dealt in domestic placements, 2 visits to addresses in Southwark, and an interview with a clergyman in Bermondsey who had, several months earlier, been approached by a young woman in distress about a matter he had declined to help with in the way she needed, and had been troubled by ever since. She was alive. She was in a rooming house in Lambeth, employed as a seamstress, which she had not been before the events of the summer. She had been told, when her father was taken, that he had escaped from prison and was hiding, that contacting the authorities would result in his rearrest and an additional sentence. She had been told this by a man who had come to her flat in Clerkenwell the day after her father's trial, and who had also told her, in terms as precisely careful as the terms used on her father, that her own safety was contingent on her cooperation. She had cooperated. She had given up the Clerkenwell flat, which was in her father's name and therefore subject to the estate's creditors in any case. She had found work. She had heard nothing of her father for 4 months, and had been, Holmes reported to me privately, in a state of managed terror that she concealed from her employer and her fellow lodgers, with a skill born entirely of necessity. Holmes told her that her father was alive and safe. He told her where he was. He told her not to go to him yet. This last instruction was the hardest thing Holmes had asked of anyone in the case so far, and Iris Ware, whom I had not yet met, but whose character Holmes described to me with the precise brevity he used when he found something genuinely remarkable, had received it with the same controlled, stoic composure that had apparently sustained her for 4 months. She had asked Holmes one question: was her father in danger? Holmes had told her the truth, which was that the danger was real but that it was being addressed. She had accepted this and remained in Lambeth. I thought, when Holmes told me this, that she and her father must have shared a quality of temperament, that particular form of persistence that does not announce itself dramatically but simply continues, through circumstances that would have broken a different structure. Lestrade received us on a Tuesday morning and listened with the patient, slightly worried expression he adopted when Holmes was presenting him with a situation that was going to require more than routine procedures. The difficulty was structural. Reginald Ware had been convicted of fraud and forgery. The conviction was on the record. For Holmes's version of events to be acted on, the conviction needed to be challenged, which required either new evidence or a formal appeal process or both. New evidence, in this case, meant finding Faulkner, identifying the man who had commissioned the forged document, and establishing that the commission had been made in good faith as far as Ware was concerned. "You have the name Faulkner," Lestrade said, with the slightly worn patience of a man who knows he is about to be told, "This is not as useful as it sounds." "A name used on a single occasion," Holmes said. "Almost certainly not his real name. What I have that is more useful is the following." He laid a series of documents on Lestrade's desk, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has sorted them in advance, in exactly the order he intends to present them. The man named Croft, who testified against Ware at trial. Croft is known to me from a previous matter in which his name appeared in connection with a land transaction in Hampshire that had certain unusual features. He is an associate of a solicitor named Pemberton, who manages legal affairs for several clients, including, I now believe, Walter Crane, the man who benefited from the forged codicil. That's circumstantial, at present. But consider, Ware was removed from prison through what I believe was an administrative arrangement made possible by someone with access to the prison's transfer documentation. That person, or those persons, did not arrange this for altruistic reasons. The extraction of a prisoner from lawful custody is a serious crime. People do not commit serious crimes to perform a favor for a stranger. Whoever arranged Ware's removal had a direct interest in Ware's continued silence. Holmes paused. I want you to make certain inquiries at the prison. Specifically, about who authorized the transfer of Reginald Ware on the 19th of July, and to which facility the transfer was officially recorded as going. Lestrade made notes. And the house on Calloway Street. The house is owned by the estate of a man named Cavendish, which is being administered by you will not be surprised, Pemberton's firm. Holmes sat back. The web is not wide, Lestrade. It is actually remarkably compact. A small number of people, working in coordination, who believed that a printer's conviction and imprisonment would close a vulnerability in a fraud that was ongoing. When the conviction did not close it cleanly enough, they extracted him and put him where they could manage him. This is not an elaborate conspiracy. It is a tidy one, and tidy ones have a very specific vulnerability. What's that? Each person in the arrangement knows about the others, and when the arrangement becomes a liability rather than an asset, when continuing it costs more than ending it, the people in it begin to calculate independently. Holmes looked at Lestrade. I have been in contact, through an intermediary, with the warder who I believe handled the practical side of Ware's extraction. He is, I think, now significantly more afraid of what happens when the full matter comes to light than he is of the people who paid him. That fear is a tool. Holmes found him in 9 days. This is a fact I set down, with the brevity of the result, because the process was not brief. It was 9 days of work that involved channels and methods. Holmes described to me only in outline, partly because some of them involved people whose participation was best not documented, and partly because Holmes, when in the deepest phase of an active investigation, has a habit of withholding the specific until the specific is confirmed. What I knew, by the end of those 9 days, was this. The man who had called himself Faulkner was a man whose real name was Thomas Say. He was 44 years old, and he worked, or had worked, before he had come to understand that Holmes was investigating the matter as a document agent, not in any official or legitimate sense, but in the specific underground sense of a man who, for the right fee, could produce, authenticate, source, or certify almost any document that a client needed and preferred not to obtain through channels that left records. He had been doing this for 11 years. He was, by Holmes's assessment, extremely good at it, not merely technically skilled, but possessed of the kind of network that made his work possible, the right contacts in the right registries, the right relationships with the right officials, the right understanding of which bureaucratic processes could be navigated quietly by someone who knew where the quiet points were. He had been brought into the Hartfield estate fraud by Pemberton, who had been his client on at least 2 previous matters. The specific work he had commissioned from Ware, the reproduction of the codicil, was a step in a larger operation that had required, at different stages, the involvement of several specialists. Say had handled the document production. Croft had handled the false testimony. Pemberton had handled the legal management of the resulting estate transfers. Walter Crane, who had benefited financially from the entire arrangement, may or may not have known the precise mechanisms by which his inheritance had been enlarged. Holmes believed he knew enough to be culpable. What Crane definitely knew was the bottom line. His share of his uncle's estate had been considerably better than it would have been under the legitimate will. Holmes located Say through a method he described as triangulation of absence, the identification of a person by the pattern of places they are no longer to be found, which tells you, if you read it correctly, where they have moved to instead. Say had vacated his usual address in Holborn shortly after the case began. He had not, however, left London. Holmes found him in a furnished set of rooms in Camden, where he had been living for the past 10 days under a different name, with a bag that was packed for departure. Holmes went to Camden with Lestrade, and I went with Holmes, and the arrest was conducted with the efficient brevity that Lestrade brought to arrests when the groundwork had been done properly in advance. Say, confronted with the specific evidence Holmes had assembled, said very little. Men of his type, in my experience, do not say very much at the moment of arrest. They calculate. The calculation, in Say's case, was a familiar one. How much cooperation would reduce the consequence, and what cooperation would cost in other directions. He began cooperating within 48 hours. It was Say who told Holmes about the wall. Not the wall of a room, exactly the cavity behind a section of plasterwork in the Holborn address he had vacated. He described its location with the precise, unemotional specificity of a man who has decided that a piece of hidden physical evidence is now more useful to him as a bargaining asset than as a secret. He gave Lestrade the address and the location. He said it contained materials relating to several matters, not just the Hartfield estate, but other commissions he had undertaken over the years. Lestrade sent 2 men to the Holborn address. Holmes and I went separately, arriving before Lestrade's men, which Holmes had managed through the simple method of having arranged with Lestrade that the official visit would happen in the afternoon and then going in the morning. The cavity behind the plaster was real. Accessing it required removing a section of wainscoting and then a piece of plasterwork behind it, work that was evident as work that had been done before. The plaster reset over the cavity in a way that was professionally invisible from the surface, but yielded immediately when you knew where to look and applied the right pressure. Inside was a wooden box, sealed with a latch. Holmes opened it. Inside the box were documents, a quantity of them, ordered with the same tidiness that characterized everything about Say's professional operation. Correspondence, copies of commissions, partial records of payments, several items that Holmes set aside immediately for separate attention. Among these was the original codicil to Edmund Hartfield's will, the actual document, not the reproduction. Say had kept it. Holmes held it up to the light from the window and examined it for a long moment in silence. "Why did he keep this?" I asked. "Insurance," Holmes said. The original document, if it surfaced, would prove 2 things: that the codicil presented in the probate proceedings was a copy, not the original, and that the original said something different, that it was the basis from which the copy was made, and therefore the copy was a forgery of a real document rather than a wholly invented one. He set it down carefully. It was Say's hold over Pemberton and Crane. They could not safely threaten him as long as he had this. "And now? Now it is evidence," Holmes said. "The most useful kind, the kind that tells you exactly what happened and exactly who arranged it, without requiring anyone to believe a printer's account against a solicitor's." The weeks that followed were, for Holmes and myself, largely administrative. I use the word without intending dismissal, the administration of a case that involves wrongful conviction, criminal conspiracy, and the extraction of a prisoner from lawful custody is not simple administration. But it is a different order of work from the investigation itself, and it belongs, with its correct weights and careful balances, in the hands of Lestrade and the legal officers and the court. Reginald Ware's conviction was formally reviewed. The original codicil from Say's hidden cache, combined with Say's detailed cooperation as a witness for the prosecution, established clearly and completely that Ware had been commissioned in good faith by a man who had withheld the true purpose of the work and had subsequently arranged to make Ware the visible point of blame. The review was not quick. Nothing in the legal system is, but it was thorough, and its conclusion was what it needed to be. Thomas Say received a sentence that was, in the judge's words, substantially reduced in recognition of the cooperation he had provided, which had been determinative in the prosecution of more serious offenders. This is the compromise the legal system makes with witnesses of his type, and it is a compromise that I find uncomfortable but understand. Holmes found it neither uncomfortable nor comfortable. He found it accurate, in the specific sense that the result it produced was the correct one, and the mechanism by which it was produced was the only available mechanism. Pemberton was charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The trial lasted 12 days. Holmes testified on 2 of them. Pemberton was convicted. Croft was charged separately as a false witness and convicted. Walter Crane presented the most complex legal situation of the case. He was a beneficiary of the fraud rather than an organizer of it, and the question of what he had known and when was the central issue in the proceedings against him. The answer, established through the documents in Say's hidden box and through several witnesses who had, once the overall case broke, become considerably more willing to speak than they had previously been, was that Crane had known enough. Not every detail, perhaps, but the essential nature of the mechanism. He had known that the codicil was not as his uncle had left it, and he had accepted the benefit of that knowledge. He was convicted of a lesser charge than the principal conspirators, but convicted nonetheless. Holmes regarded this outcome as approximately correct. There is a moment in the documentation of a case at which the legal record and the human record diverge, and what remains in the human record is what the legal one cannot contain. The day that Reginald Ware was formally informed that his conviction had been set aside and that he was, in the eyes of the law, once again a man of unblemished record, that day I was not present for. Holmes was not present either, by his own choice. These things, he told me once, are best experienced without witnesses who carry a professional interest in the outcome. I know what happened only from what Ware told me when I next saw him, a week later, at Baker Street. He had brought his daughter. Iris Ware was 30 years old, as I had calculated from Holmes's description, and she was the product of her father in the particular way that children are sometimes the product of a parent not in appearance, which was different, but in the quality of attention she brought to things, the precise and careful way she spoke, the sense she gave of a person who took very little for granted. She thanked Holmes directly and without effusion, which was the right approach. Holmes received her thanks with the brief, compressed acknowledgement he gave thanks that he found genuine. He is not comfortable with gratitude, particularly when the gratitude is earned rather than social, but he does not dismiss it. He receives it as what it is and moves on. Ware told us, during that visit, that the printing house in Clerkenwell had been let to other tenants during the events of the past year, and that he would need to find new premises if he intended to resume the business. He said this not with bitterness, but with the flat practicality of a man who has itemized his losses and is now itemizing the starting conditions for whatever comes next. "Will you resume it?" I asked. "I think so," he said. "It's what I know how to do." A pause. "Though perhaps not the specialized document reproduction work. I find I have a somewhat different feeling about that than I had before. I thought this was, under the circumstances, entirely understandable." Holmes and I talked about the case on one occasion after it was concluded, not at great length, because great length was not, in this case, what the subject required. He said, at one point in that conversation, that what had distinguished the Ware case from several superficially similar ones he had worked was the specificity of the cruelty. Not the cruelty of the fraud itself. Financial crimes are cruel in aggregate, but impersonal in mechanism. The specific cruelty was the use of Iris Ware as the instrument of her father's compliance. "A man alone," Holmes said, "can endure almost anything if he convinces himself that endurance is worthwhile. The way to break that endurance is not to increase the pressure on the man himself. It is to place the pressure on someone he loves and make him understand that his behavior determines their safety. It is a technique that requires no violence and leaves no mark, and it is the most reliable method available for controlling a person who would otherwise be uncontrollable. You've seen it before, I said. More often than I would like. It is used in domestic situations with a regularity that the law addresses very inadequately. It is used in criminal enterprises when the cooperation required is specific and the cooperating party cannot be trusted to supply it through greed or fear alone. He paused. What I find most interesting about its use in this case is that it was unnecessary. Ware was in prison. He was convicted. He was silenced already. The decision to extract him and hold him was made because someone was not satisfied with a silence he could not control and wanted a silence that was actively maintained. That is not rational calculation. That is anxiety masquerading as precaution. And the anxiety revealed the network, I said. It did. If they had left him in prison, I would likely never have been involved. Dr. Watson stumbling upon a bolted basement door was not a risk they should have been carrying. He finished his tea. Which is the consistent lesson of overcomplicated precautions. The complication creates more exposure than the original risk. A problem that has been managed is usually safer than a problem that has been eliminated by a method that itself requires management. He set his cup down. Faulkner Say is a man who understood documents and bureaucratic systems extremely well and understood human consequences less well than he thought he did. Most frauds, in my experience, are built by people with that exact imbalance. I thought about this. What will you tell people if they ask about the case? Holmes considered the question with the slight deliberateness he brought to questions about how he chose to represent his own work. I will tell them that the case began with a sound heard through a floor, and that everything else followed from the decision to go down the stairs. He paused. That is not a lesson about detection. It is a lesson about what happens when you follow what you hear, rather than explaining it away. Most people explain away the sounds they are not expecting. Watson did not. That is why the case was opened. I received this, I confess, with more pleasure than I am prepared to record in full detail. What I will record is this. I did go down the stairs. I am not certain that another man, in the same position, would have. I am not certain that I was especially brave or especially perceptive. What I am certain of is that the sound I heard was a sound that required a response, and that when I went to look, the worst thing I could have found a person in distress, a person who needed help, was exactly what I found. These things do not always resolve as they should. Cases close, convictions are reviewed, evidence is found behind walls. Men sit in their Baker Street armchairs and diagnose the structural flaws in criminal enterprises with the same steady intelligence they bring to everything. But people remain in basement rooms for months at a time, and daughters remain in Lambeth rooms for months at a time, and none of that time is given back. What is given back, in the best outcome, is simply this, the truth, and a chance to use it. That is not everything, but it is what the law can offer, and it is, on the days when it is what actually happens, more than sufficient to justify the work.